utilize emotional intelligence in the workplace, you might also be wondering what this has to do with DEI. This illustrates the many facets of DEI and how to bridge the gap to emotional intelligence. We are excited to have you here with us today. This conversation has many of you buzzing for more. I am looking forward to you meeting my co host today. We value your feedback. Please drop your comments in the chat and the comment boxes on social media. We intend to respond to as many comments and questions as possible. Please take this, understand that today is going to be a special conversation on Black male emotional intelligence. It took a great deal of effort for us to pull this off, so we're always eternally grateful to all of our loyal guests. Follow us. Diversity Connects Us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and my business partner and co-host is Dr. Rudel. We're both DEI consultants. As an EQ coach and authoress of Emotional Intelligence, a toolkit for managing diversity, equity, and inclusion, in my book, I share strategies and practical examples of EQ. The link to purchase the book will be in the comments. For a living, we help organizations implement DEI plans with emotional intelligence framework and to help reframe the cultural mindsets through thought-provoking workshops and webinars. Join us as we share the different voices in the DEI space. Here today with us is Dr. Rudel. Hi, and how are you today? Oh, you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Now I can.
Excellent. It's a pleasure to be here today. Just to give a little background. So I am an organizational psychologist by trade. I hold a doctorate in organizational leadership psychology with a focus on the neuroscience of leadership and a master's degree in clinical social work. And that's really where I got my start. And, I've spent at this point the better part of the last 20 years studying the human condition, specific to the factors that often prevent us from functioning optimally in the different areas of our life. So, with that, I am thrilled about today's conversation. And I would add before we get going that the goal today was to take a deeper dive into emotional intelligence and how this shows up for Black men, perhaps a deeper dive than we've taken before. And what that looks like through my lens is surfacing a lot of my lived experience throughout this conversation that we're about to have today. So, with that, looking forward to it. And I'd love to hand it over to you, Rachel, to get us going.
Absolutely. So let's dive in. So you mentioned there's a few things you mentioned, but I'll wait a little bit until we start our conversation.
Mhm.
So as a Black man, you would say, how have you utilized EQ throughout your professional trajectory?
Yeah, so it's long before I ever heard the term emotional intelligence, I was practicing emotional intelligence, as is the case for most of us, particularly Black men. For me, it was at a young age, and I'm recalling my first employment experience right after undergrad. And just to give some context, I was the first Black male that this organization had ever hired in an executive role. So my title was district executive. I oversaw 77 locations in the city of Boston, Greater Boston, and during that time, I was tested a lot. I was tested a lot by the population that I was servicing at that time. And one of the things I grew to understand was that the organization recognized a need to diversify their workforce. However, their target demographic had not only never, you know, interacted with a Black male district executive before, but it felt like they, and I hate to generalize, but it felt like there was limited exposure to folks of color, generally speaking, across the board. So there's that, but we'll put that aside for a minute. I remember one day getting triggered and making a conscious decision to bite my tongue. And I sat there and I processed all of this. And sort of like it went from, anger to being able to realize that I was angry, to then processing what triggered me, to then understanding that I would need to communicate how I was feeling, but I couldn't put the feeling out there in its raw form, that there would need to be some filtering going on. And, looking back now, that was probably the first experience I had with emotional intelligence. And then, of course, it would continue to surface throughout my trajectory from then to now.
So what continues to surface for you?
I would say a reminder of the importance of what I represent.
Mm.
So for folks that look like us, particularly for Black men, we'll talk about Black men today since that's the focus. It's remembering at the end of the day, 6'1", 250, bald, Black. As I've said before, when I get upset, when I get frustrated, chances are it's going to be received and interpreted differently than my non-Black counterparts. So to this day, it's remembering or understanding the value of not just reacting, and also understanding that there's oftentimes consequences for our reactions, right? So having to sort of toe the line between, sharing what it is that I'm feeling, but doing it in a way that's productive and constructive, and where I'm not going to lose my job
Or your mind.
or my mind. Or my mind. Exactly.
You mentioned something early on, and I want to see if we can tie this together. You mentioned your background also in neuroscience. How can we tie, and again, this is in the perspective of a Black male lens. So how can we tie neuroscience to emotional intelligence? Because what I understood is that you've been able to become self-aware of the emotion that you're going through.
Yeah.
And then you de-escalated yourself. You went from anger to realizing you were angry, and then to a level of, this is not the time for me to discuss what I'm feeling, so that you could table it to move on. What does that really have to do with neuroscience, and how is it connected?
So great question, first of all. I think I would boil all of this down to awareness, as you mentioned, right? But when I say awareness from a neuroscience perspective, it's being in tune and aware in moments when we've been triggered, in moments when we're agitated, angry, upset, whatever it is, being able to name that emotion, recognize it for what it is, and then take steps to process it in an appropriate manner. So our thinking is directly connected to how we feel, which in turn influences how we respond and our behavioral patterns. So it's keeping all of that in mind, keeping that connection in mind, right? So it is in moments when our thinking is healthy that we're then in position to respond in the most appropriate manner. So that's a connection that we often don't pay enough mind to. Um, you know, we can't just react. You know, I know people, unfortunately, I can think of someone in particular who struggles to maintain employment, black male, because when he gets triggered, you know, he can't contain it. Right. So now it's becoming triggered, and rightfully so a lot of the time. Um, but there in that case, there's not a ton of thought. It seems to be sort of this knee-jerk-ish reaction.
How does that deteriorate? And I'll say ours for this particular instance, because I think it affects us all the same way, our mental health, but particularly Black mental health, Black male mental health.
Mhm. Because at the end of the day, if there's like, for example, how many times have you gotten up and went to work in moments when your mood's a little off, you're a little down, or you're worked up in some way, right? Um, if we don't recognize that in the moment, it's almost like then a ticking time bomb in a sense, because the first thing that sets us off is going to create a pathway for us to react. Now, on the surface, it's about what just took place, when in actuality, that emotional outburst is actually rooted in something that happened either earlier in the morning or the day before or whatever it is. So it goes back to the importance of um, being aware and in tune. And we've talked a lot about self-awareness, but I want to try to expand that perspective a little bit. There also needs to be a measure of external awareness as well, being aware of our environment.
Social awareness,
Yes,
right?
social awareness, and this can be in any setting, right? So a social awareness, it could be in the workplace, it could be in wherever we're at in that moment, just a general acknowledgement of the environment, and factoring that in as well, right? We're all entitled to feel how we feel. It's been my experience, though, as a black man, that I often need to filter um, what it is that I want to say. I have to really watch my responses and my reactions, because it often feels like things are taken out of context. So with that said, it's almost like I have to turn the volume way down on my reaction. So when I do react, folks around me don't know this, but they're getting a percentage of what's actually going on for me internally. And it's that filtering and that turning the volume down that over time can lead to some really unhealthy physiological conditions. I didn't realize this, but for the first maybe 5 years of my professional trajectory, I was depressed.
What
Didn't
made
realize.
you realize it though?
You know what? It took me going through stages of adult development and getting into my 30s before I then was able to look back and recognize that I was in these environments that were not supportive emotionally and or mentally. Um, we throw the term around psych safety a lot, right? Or I like to present another term, organizational safety, right? So psych safety is great, but if we don't have organizational safety, um, it makes it really hard to bring our whole self into the environment, right? So it begins with, if you think of it in this context, it begins with org safety, and that then instills in us psych safety, and then we're able to go from there. If it's just a sense of psych safety on an individual level, but the environment that we're in doesn't feel safe, it's a bit of a setup.
Mm. And the when so I think what's really, I had a few lots of feedback with a post I had released on social media in regards to Black emotional intelligence and also Black masculinity. And when you mentioned that you were depressed, you actually were able to put a word to it because you realized thereafter that you were. What, what symptoms, this might be a little bit technical, but for really the audience, because I know a lot of the males that were giving me feedback were intrigued, and apparently my post was spot on, and they clearly had felt some of those things. So when you talk about depression, from a male perspective, what did that look like for you in retrospect?
So as real as I can put it, going back to the time period, right? So I'm in my early 20s. It was making very poor life decisions.
Mm,
And it was engaging in, what I would, looking back now, risky behavior, you know. So feeling some kind of way, no worries. Stop at the liquor store, get some, get a bottle of whatever, go to your boy's house, spend some time, right? Get your mind right. And then, you're off and running. But I would grow to understand that those habits were only masking what I was feeling at that time, instead of actually, coping with these very real feelings. I didn't feel like I fit into the work environment. And in fact, because of where I lived at the time, it was like working and living in two extremely different environments, and feeling almost like, I certainly didn't feel like I belonged in the work environment, but I actually got to a point where I started to question myself when I went back home, because I had spent all day around folks that not only didn't look like me, but didn't seem to value and or appreciate my contribution or make any real attempt to, provide the kind of support that I would have needed at that time. And I just think, looking back, it was a perfect storm. Um,
mm,
and I think for many of us, Black men, it's, you know, I'm feeling some kind of way, so I'm going to engage in this behavior because this behavior right here is instant gratification.
so,
Yes, that might be true, but it doesn't address the actual issue.
so it's a temporary fix.
It's a temporary fix. And so, like, for me, my early 20s, it was one temporary fix after another. And it wasn't until my thinking evolved and I evolved as a human being, where I got to a point where I started to recognize, um these were not habits that one should grow old with. So now that opens up a whole other sort of conversation around self-care.
Mm.
So like me now, I have a journal sitting over there, but I journal, I write my thoughts out. you know um I will go for a long drive. There's a coffee shop. I'm a big coffee guy. And there's a coffee shop that I
Mhm.
love, and it's about a half hour from here to Old Italian Bakery. And I will take that drive for a cup of coffee because it does two things, right? I love my coffee, but it also gives me, it's an outlet. For a while I was painting landscapes, acrylic and oil. Um, but the absence of those sort of healthy outlets, or even the absence of the mindset to recognize the need for healthy outlets, it just makes for a sort of more complex sort of situation, and almost like the perfect storm.
Right. And you don't have to answer this, but I think what most of the feedback was and what I had mentioned in the post was normalizing mental health.
Yeah.
And in normalizing mental health, I think what's imperative is that we start having these conversations at our own family roundtables
Yeah.
so that it's normal to seek the help. And then my question to you, and again, you don't have to answer it, do you think in retrospect you would have sought help, or was that even an option?
In retrospect, first of all, I want to answer that question because I want to do with our show today. um I view this as an opportunity to have some real conversation, some real dialogue. So we're going to strip away the layers and make this as real as possible. But looking back, I absolutely should have sought help. And for me to just be a little more clear, um, I needed therapy. I needed therapy during that time, but I didn't. It was a shame that I felt, and so like I hid. Nobody knew. Like my family didn't even know. And I'll give you another example, man. And I mean, just to make this real, the journaling didn't start recently. The very first time that I journaled, I'll never forget this. I was 22 years old, and I was going through it, but didn't feel like I had anyone that I could talk to. So I remember going to a Hallmark store. I got myself a journal, and I remember spending my lunch breaks. I would get in the car, I would drive up the street around the corner to like a little park and just write it out. You know what I
Write out
mean?
your thoughts.
Yep. Yep. Um, and looking back now, that was probably, yeah. So much of what I was doing was like a cry for help, you know. And again, I mean, not to put my business out there, but but I already have. Going back to that same time period, that's why I had so many girlfriends, right? And why I was sort of living this sort of fast, because it was okay, so I'm on the clock, I'm having what I would call an unfavorable, workplace experience. And I would try to offset that by, I mean, I was a young man, had a nice car, had an apartment, had roommates. I would offset my day with just ridiculousness at night, you know. Yeah. And so now me, I'm in my 40s, 45, and I'm now I'm able, to look back and better understand myself. But also better understand that some of those environments that I was in, they wanted me, but they weren't ready for me. They didn't know how to set me up for success. So that first employer that hired me out of undergrad gave me this amazing job, district executive. I'm overseeing 77 locations. I'm driving around the city. But when I got to these locations, my presence was met with resistance. And then when I would go to the office, at no point did anyone name the fact that I was the only person of color on staff at that time and the only Black male that they ever had. So all these realizations as I've evolved.
Right. You mentioned something, and I think it's probably cultural. I was reading statistics, and I think it's 1 in 5 men have, have a mental trauma or mental unwellness, and then compared to white males, and how the suicidal rate is much higher for Black males than it is for white males. And when I listen to as I'm having the conversation with you, I think also culturally, and that's why I put very, very many resources for for Black males to seek out support, more so Black support, like a Black psychologist, a Black therapist, a Black counselor. And I think culturally there's a shamefulness attached to seeking support or help because it's not talked about. Is that, that's something that's familiar?
Absolutely.
Not the suicide part, but the shame part.
Yeah. And I may have shared this story with you before. I apologize if I had, but I remember I was a kid coming home from football practice. My dad comes to pick me up, and I had injured another player on one of the plays, and it was a white male on the on my team, actually, because this was a practice, and so we had one half of the team, against the other. The point is, when I injured him, it was obviously an accident. We were kids. All of these fathers ran onto the field, all of these white men. And at the time, I remember just feeling like they were like giants because they're all in my face and whatever. My father was parked off to the side, and he was reading the paper. He didn't see. So they yell at me. I collect my stuff. At that point, practice is over. I get back to the car. My dad sees me getting emotional, and he's like, stop it. What are you doing? What's wrong? And so I tell him, and it was like he was upset and disappointed by the emotion that I was displaying in that moment. Right? Love my father dearly. Has nothing to do with him. My father's like my best friend. In that moment, I saw his Martinican culture. I felt that West Indian culture, right? And so inadvertently, the message that sent to me was that it's not okay to express emotion outwardly.
And funny, now that you've made it your life's mission to be able to to support other men like you and other people in general, because I think that's the kind of, I know even with us as partners, it's how are you, and there's always an emphasis on you.
Yeah.
When do you think that happened?
It was in my 30s.
Mm.
It was in my mid 30s. There was this transition. Probably like when I was around 34, 35, and I started like adulting for real and started like coming into my own and started recognizing that the pressure on my professional trajectory was starting to mount. And if I didn't have the emotional toolkit to manage that, I wasn't going to survive. The unfortunate thing about my trajectory is the higher up I've moved, the less and less people I interact with people that look like me. And it was right around that time that I started to really understand what I would need from an emotional maturity perspective in order to be successful. And I kept working, but I went back to school and I pursued my master's in clinical social work, um, because I wanted to. At the time, I remember I had done a lot of youth work at that point in time. So I'd done a lot of work with like at risk youth, um, gang involved, gang related populations, and just at risk, generally speaking, transitional age. Um, so in that age group from like 17 to like 23. And one of the things that propelled me to go back to school was wanting to be available to our young men
Mm.
in a clinical manner, like wanting to provide support. I wanted to be that person that could sit across from them and sit across from them, look like them, and be able to say, I hear you, I see you, and it's okay. I got you. We'll walk through this process together.
Right.
You know?
So, in your research, you've uncovered several concepts that underscore the importance of awareness around the cross section between racial identity and mental health. What are some of the key takeaways you would think from your research?
So there's a few. And there's a concept that comes to mind. Um, there's dependent self schema. So that's how I view the world around me and how you view the world around you, right? So dependent um, self schema. Now
So,
there's
okay, go ahead.
no.
So, is that also dependent on your external environment?
Absolutely.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. And so to take it a step further, because there's like a second part to this concept, is interdependent self schema. So now it's okay, this is my worldview, that's your worldview. There's a little space here in the middle. That's interdependent self schema. That's how my view and your view play off of one another to help sort of co create our reality in that moment. And so the value that that had for me was understanding that as a Black man, there's how I view the world and how I make meaning of every environment that I'm in, but it also opens up a pathway for me to want to understand how I am being received by the person I'm interacting with. So there's how I'm making meaning, there's how that person's making meaning, but then there's that space in the middle. And so one of the things that it encouraged me to do was to have more conversation in my day to day about difference. So I often will name it. I don't run from it. I'll acknowledge it in a healthy way and create opportunity to talk about it.
And that's emotional intelligence.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's a skill. I believe it's a
Mhm.
skill that definitely we can all develop.
Yeah.
It's a hard skill to develop because I think, like, the person you mentioned earlier who's often triggered, he's in a very angry state,
Yeah.
and rightfully so. And I think the skill would be to question and look in the mirror and ask, why is it that I'm angry?
Yeah.
Why am I? Because, beneath the anger, there was a book I read and some articles that I read in Harvard Business Review. Beneath the anger is pain.
Yeah.
And it's something that happened and that it continues to happen over and over and over and over again. and then it wells up because it's not being talked about. We're not having these courageous conversations at our tables. And because of the cultural stigma, there could be a religious stigma, all these stigmas attached to what mental health or distress might look like. And it just keeps piling one on top of another. So when you go back and you think organizational safety, which is going to be our next question, it's okay, well, I haven't been safe for this long,
Yeah.
which caused me to be angry,
Yeah.
person A. And then person A goes into the organization carrying all these emotions and not being able to park them and understand where they came from because person A hasn't spoken about it ever.
Yeah. Yeah.
So now it's a double whammy.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
now if the space is not safe, then that's like a ticking time bomb for that person.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep. Yeah. And I would add, because listening to you just now reminded me of, even to this day, how much is actually going on for me, on a neurological level in the workplace at any given moment. There's, do I sound articulate enough? There's no doing your job. Um, you got to be twice as good. Mediocrity isn't a thing, doesn't exist. I don't have the luxury of being mediocre, right? Wasting all of this time on appearance. Do I look the part? I wear a lot of hats right now, right? So there's an organizational psychologist thing, there's the professor thing, there's a senior consultant thing. You and I, business partners, we have a growing, firm. There's a lot of opportunity for imposter syndrome, a lot of opportunity for this sort of pressure that I constantly feel as I oscillate between these roles. Because at any given moment, you and I are more than just, your founder for our business, right? I'm co-founder, but it's deeper than that, right? So like I'm co-founder, I am co-founder while Black. I am senior consultant while Black. I'm being a professor while Black, right? So it's having to contend with the complexity of my dimensions of diversity, because there's multiple layers there. Yeah.
Can you provide some context around organizational therapy? Like, why is this concept so important?
Organizational safety?
Organizational safety. What did I say?
Organizational therapy. I was like, wow, look at you coining terms. That's what's up.
Sounds like a therapy session.
There you go. There you go.
Freudian slip. So when we
Yeah.
talk about, organizational safety, what is this concept, or why is this concept so important to creating inclusive workplace environments?
So organizational safety can be connected to a few really, really important indicators of organizational health, right? And I'll break those down. Job retention, employee satisfaction, and employee productivity. So in instances where organizational safety has been established, there is a increase in job retention, decrease in turnover, increase in employee satisfaction, and employee productivity. So it matters. It matters. It matters from different perspectives, right? So from the employee perspective, it's like that ingredient that allows me to bring my whole self into the workplace. But it also matters from the employer perspective, because they now have created an environment where folks don't want to leave, and folks
Mm.
feel valued enough to want to stay and be a part of that system. So it is a very valuable concept, but it's often overlooked. So we've gotten to this point in time where we hear an awful lot of talk about psych safety and not enough talk, in my view, on or around organizational safety.
Right. What can organizations actually do to increase organizational safety? I was going to say therapy again.
So
Maybe they should provide therapy. Maybe that's my message today.
yeah, right. So um the the most effective tool that we have within the context of this discussion, there's two tools: dialogue and listening. So to go back to your question, it's creating spaces for employees to share and provide insight and or reflections on how they're experiencing the day-to-day workplace environment. And now taking that data, breaking it down, surfacing the thematic findings, and now baking into the org culture what it is people are indicating that they will need in order to feel like they can bring their whole self. So really it's I mean, all of that to say, having conversations with employees, and not having conversations just to create space for people to talk, but to have generative conversations specific to workplace culture, right? And make it explicit, make it known. We're having these conversations because we want to hear from you all. What is it that you need? What is it that you'd want to see, so that you can bring your whole self into the workplace, right? So that's the dialogue. The second component of that would be the listening. So active and reflective listening. So listening actively, showing that you're engaged, nodding, through your mannerisms, finding some way to communicate that you're receiving the information. Reflective listening is actually now taking it a step further. Reflective listening is now repeating back to the person what they've said, so that you do two things. You let them know you're listening, but you're also creating opportunities for clarity in the event that what you think you heard differs from what they actually said. So it really is having conversations, if held effectively, can foster a sense of organizational safety.
And is that empathy?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And when it comes from our employers, when it comes
Mm,
from our leaders, it can be really powerful. Nothing is better than knowing
mm.
that your boss sees you, gets you, supports you, and understands you. And even if they don't understand you, they're willing to they're making efforts to understand you. To me, nothing's better than that. When I look back on my trajectory as an employee, those are the moments when I've been the most effective in my
Mm.
role.
And as a professor now, are those maybe maybe not directly relating to you, but let's say in other colleges or universities, is that something that administrations or or professors should, or even, yeah, the preferably the administration, to implement to actually get a sense if the students are being well received and being included in conversations? because it starts there before you go to work. You're in school. Everyone's in school,
Yep. Yeah.
and if they don't have a pulse of what the students are feeling or in
Mhm.
relation to the teacher, then that also doesn't promote school safety.
Yeah, yeah, and I am thrilled with where we're at right now on a societal level in terms of the focus on social and emotional learning in our academic institutions. You know, it took a while for us to get here, but we're here. And it's amazing to see those conversations happening, to see those cultures being created where students are being afforded opportunities to share their perspective in terms of how they're experiencing the environment, and in a sense, um, seeing this sort of co-creation where professors and teachers are including students in a dialogue around what's needed to optimize the learning experience.
Right.
um, yeah.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And what would be your takeaway to mostly the Black male audience today? What
Yeah.
would you want them to take away?
To continue to acknowledge and own what you're experiencing emotionally and mentally, to not run from it, but to embrace it. For too long, we've sat in this space where, we've essentially been told, in not so many words, but like, we're supposed to be robots. We're supposed to be immune to, feeling down or sad or depressed or anxious or whatever it is. But, I would encourage, um, you know, our Black men to understand the value of coping strategies and the value of making space and time for emotional health and well-being.
Right. And not to feel ashamed.
Hmm.
I
Yep.
think that's crucial also, not to feel ashamed. There's a lot of societal pressures on what it is to be masculine. And according to society, that's not one of them. But
Yeah. Well, as we've evolved, it's important that our perspective evolve as well. To understand that we are the complex beings that we are, and there's no shame in acknowledging how you feel at all.
absolutely. What a great conversation. As we reach the top of the Diversity Connects Us hour, I want to thank you for listening. This podcast highlights lived and shared inspirational stories of strength and tenacity. We share profound and courageous conversations that influence DEI and emotional intelligence by breaking the barriers and labels of stereotypes, confronting biases, and offering best practices to achieve a more significant and cultural mindset. Stay tuned as we continue to share our voices in the DEI space. To trend with us, hashtag diversity connects us.